Hey guys, tonight, we dive deep into the heart of the Middle Ages, focusing not on the kings and castles, but on the unvarnished truths and the mundane realities of everyday existence. We explore the awkward, unglamorous facets of life, the things so normalized back then that no one bothered to write them down, an omission which we, honestly, find quite rude. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this peculiar journey through history. And as always, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It remains fascinating to connect with our audience across the globe. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that subtle, comforting background hum. And let's ease into tonight's historical expedition together. One of the most persistent historical myths we cling to is the notion that medieval people were static. The lie suggests they were born in one secluded village, died in the same bed, never straying far from the familiar scent of the local dairy cow. In truth, medieval life was far less a rooted farming community and far more a permanent state of low-grade, necessity-driven relocation. People moved constantly, typically not in pursuit of opportunity, but because circumstances had turned disastrous. Crops failed, lords unilaterally raised rents, or armies marched through, consuming everything edible and leaving behind the medieval equivalent of an unapologetic note written in hoofprints. When disaster struck, peasants knew better than to complain. A complaint was often dangerous. They packed. And by packing, we mean they grabbed anything that wasn't affixed to the structure, debated intensely whether the old cooking pot was worth the wait, and started walking. They were moving not toward a better life, but toward a location that might be, perhaps, slightly less cursed. Seasonal work added significant volatility to this pattern. The Isthmian Games took place on one of the most strategically significant strips of land in the ancient Greek world. The Isthmus of Corinth was a narrow bridge connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, a pivotal place where land routes met vital sea lanes and where movement never truly ceased. Ships sailed past on either side, were sometimes hauled across the land, or docked nearby, while merchants, sailors, envoys, and travelers flowed through Corinth every single day. When the Isthmian Games commenced, this constant motion only intensified rather than paused. The festival was held in honor of Poseidon, the god who ruled the oceans, shook the earth, and governed horses. For Corinth, this was not mere symbolic worship. Poseidon was the deity who explicitly protected their ships, their harbors, and their immense wealth. His sanctuary lay just outside the city, surrounded by pine trees and open ground, close enough to feel connected to Corinth's power, yet distant enough to be deemed sacred. During the Games, this space became the pulsating heart of the Greek world. Unlike the Olympic Games, which required a laborious journey inland and weeks of travel, the Isthmian Games were easily accessible. This accessibility fundamentally shaped their character. Sailors could attend between voyages. Traders could combine lucrative business with magnificent spectacle. Diplomats arrived knowing they would encounter rivals and allies efficiently in one place. The Games were pan-Hellenic, but they possessed a practical, busy, and vibrant atmosphere. Athletic competition was only one component of the event. Religious rites opened the festival, featuring solemn sacrifices made to Poseidon and grand processions moving through the sanctuary. The potent smell of burning offerings mingled with the fresh sea air. Victories were framed not just as physical triumphs, but as profound signs of divine favor. To win at Corinth was to impress both gods and men simultaneously. Harvests pulled laborers across entire regions, while major religious festivals triggered mass human migrations. Thousands of people would collectively decide that walking for weeks to stand in a distant field and pray constituted a perfectly reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were immensely popular, largely because nothing confirms spiritual growth quite like acquiring blistered feet and severe food poisoning. Travel itself was an ordeal. Roads were perpetually muddy tracks. Mud was the defining characteristic of medieval transit. In winter, travelers risked sinking. In summer, they choked on dust. Signposts were virtually non-existent, and maps, when they existed, were often works of optimistic fiction. Getting lost was not an accident. It was the default operational setting. And yet, people persisted, because staying put could be the greater danger. If a local lord suddenly remembered your existence and decided to demand exorbitant new taxes, walking away might save your entire family. While medieval society liked to pretend that peasants were legally and spiritually bound to the land in perpetuity, reality quietly contradicted this idea. Villages operated as revolving doors of humanity. New faces arrived daily, and old ones disappeared under the cover of night. Few people asked too many questions, knowing that tomorrow they might be the ones vanishing with a sack of grain and a growing sense of desperation. Even unofficial news traveled at remarkable speed. A merchant with flexible morals and a naturally loud voice could spread rumors across half a kingdom faster than a royal messenger who actually possessed the authority and knowledge to deliver official dispatches. Thus, medieval people were not static figures trapped in amber. They were exhausted, mobile survivors, constantly hiking away from one set of problems, usually straight into another. History imposes neat borders. Medieval people walked right over them, slowly complaining the entire way. The setting mattered deeply. Surrounded by major trade routes and wealth, the Isthmian Games became a place where reputation could be built with astonishing speed. Athletes gained lasting fame, cities proudly advertised their power, and individuals sought recognition far beyond their local communities. Poets recited new verses, musicians performed, and philosophers found eager audiences among the massive crowds. Even those who did not compete found ways to be seen and heard. The Isthmian Games were not a retreat from everyday life. They amplified it, turning movement, competition, and ambition into a structured ritual, proving that in ancient Greece, sacred celebration and worldly success often occupied the very same space. At the center of the Isthmian Games stood Poseidon, a god whose overwhelming authority perfectly matched Corinth's own ambitions. Unlike Zeus, who ruled from distant, serene heights, Poseidon was immediate and volatile. He commanded the seas that nourished Corinth's trade, the earthquakes that could destroy entire cities without warning, and the horses that symbolized speed, prestige, and control. Honoring him was not optional. It was a fundamental matter of survival. The games therefore began with ritual, not sport. Before any athletic contest took place, solemn sacrifices were offered at Poseidon's sanctuary. Bulls, rams, and other select animals were presented at the altar, their blood sealing the bond between the god and the community. These rites constantly reminded participants that victory did not spring from strength alone. Divine favor was paramount, and neglecting it invited disaster. For Corinth, hosting the games was a powerful act of political theology. By overseeing Poseidon's essential festival, the city claimed a special, privileged relationship with the god. This association reinforced Corinth's critical maritime identity and justified its extensive influence across all Greek trade networks. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotionally intense, and almost always subject to administrative delegation. While people were perfectly capable of falling deeply in love, the vast majority lacked the requisite literacy to document their feelings. Writing was rare, costly, and largely restricted to the clergy, the nobility, and that singular individual in every town who perpetually corrected everyone else's grammar. So, when medieval lovers wished to express affection, devotion, or uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, or occasionally, a monk. Nothing shatters the romantic mood quite like whispering your deepest, most vulnerable feelings to a man who has taken a vow of celibacy and who is simultaneously grading your vocabulary. Picture the scene. You enter a small, sterile room scented with ink, parchment, and quiet professional disappointment. You clear your throat and state, "I require a letter, a love letter." The scribe remains calm, dips his quill, and asks clinically, "How intense are we defining this emotion?" Then begins the confession. You must dictate your feelings aloud, slowly, carefully, while another human being meticulously records every word with the emotional detachment of someone taking grocery inventory. You declare, "Tell her that my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up, and clarifies, "Burns as in spiritually consumed, or burns as in concerningly inflammatory?" Naturally, standards prevailed. Medieval love letters rigidly adhered to formal structures. They required opening praises, intense emotional declarations, solemn vows of loyalty, and dramatic flourishes often lifted directly from classical texts. If your own eloquence was lacking, the scribe was there to assist. Would you prefer to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine radiance? This was not an optional stylistic choice. Romance followed specific formatting rules. The games quietly advertised Corinth as a city that was both wealthy and divinely protected, a city under perpetual watch. Athletes understood this dynamic well. Many dedicated their participation to Poseidon before competing, offering sincere prayers, small votive gifts, or binding vows in exchange for success. A win was more than personal glory. It was tangible proof that the god had noticed you. Dedications abundantly filled the sanctuary. Helmets, tripods, statues, and inscriptions, each marking a significant moment when human effort received divine approval. The sacred nature of the games also imposed specific rules. Warfare was discouraged during the festival period, and safe passage was expected for all travelers. While this truce was not always perfectly honored, the expectation itself was crucial. It reminded Greek states that shared worship could momentarily outweigh their petty conflicts. Even bitter rivals stood together beneath Poseidon's watchful gaze. Yet, the god's presence carried anxiety as well as comfort. Poseidon was notoriously known for sudden, violent wrath. Storms, catastrophic earthquakes, and shipwrecks were inevitably read as signs of his displeasure. The games, therefore, carried an undercurrent of urgency. Rituals had to be performed meticulously. Offenses could not be ignored. Mistakes risked more than mere embarrassment. The Isthmian Games were not entertainment lightly dressed as religion. They were religion enacted through intense competition. Every race, song, and sacrifice unfolded beneath the chilling awareness that the sea god was watching, and that his favor could instantly lift a man or a city up, or cast them suddenly down. Once the rituals were complete, the focus shifted entirely to the athletes themselves. The Isthmian Games drew competitors from across the Greek world, each arriving with months or years of relentless preparation behind them. Training was intense and physically brutal. To complicate matters further, the scribe often knew both parties intimately. Small towns afforded no anonymity. Your declaration of undying love might be penned by the same individual who baptized your crush, taught her cousin to read, and was absolutely certain she was already betrothed to the local miller. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was merely a desperate hope. Sometimes, scribes accidentally reused material. When one writes dozens of ardent missives annually, certain patterns are inevitable. Somewhere, two medieval lovers received suspiciously identical compliments and, fortunately, never thought to compare notes. And then there was the delivery. Letters were carried by messengers, trusted friends, or whoever owed you a substantial favor. There was no privacy seal beyond a wafer of wax and pure faith. Anyone handling the document could read it, laugh, or worse, memorize your romantic desperation for later public entertainment. Yet, despite this gauntlet of logistics and witnesses, medieval love letters worked. People married, illicit affairs blossomed, hearts were broken, and love somehow survived the interference of quills, clerical witnesses, reused metaphors, and opinionated monks. Romance was not private, nor was it discreet, but it was profoundly sincere, even when dictated by proxy. And that, perhaps, is the most quintessentially medieval thing of all. In medieval society, being left-handed was far from a harmless quirk. It was an immediate red flag, a quiet warning sign, and a gentle suggestion from the cosmos that something about the individual was fundamentally skewed. And by skewed, medieval people meant potentially cursed, morally suspect, or one bad day away from practicing minor witchcraft. The issue began with potent symbolism. The Latin word for left is sinister, which provides all the necessary context. Right-handedness was universally associated with divine favor, order, righteousness, and competence. Athletes lived strictly disciplined lives, shaping their bodies through repetitive drills, strict diets, and constant supervision. Victory at Corinth promised fame that traveled quickly along the very same trade routes that enriched the city. Events included foot races, wrestling, boxing, the brutal pancration, and dramatic chariot contests. These were not polite exhibitions. They were violent, exhausting tests of endurance and control. There were no second prizes awarded. To lose was to disappear instantly back into anonymity. To win was to have your name remembered, sometimes permanently engraved in stone, sometimes repeated endlessly by poets and the crowds. Unlike modern athletes, these competitors were not amateurs in spirit, even if the physical prizes were symbolic. Wreaths of pine, or later, celery, crowned the winners, but the real rewards followed immediately afterward. Victorious athletes returned home to high honors, public state meals, significant financial rewards, and political influence. A single win at the Isthmian Games could elevate an entire family's standing. The games also distinctly reflected regional styles. Some cities became renowned for producing exceptionally strong wrestlers, others for their fast runners, or for highly skilled charioteers. These reputations truly mattered. Athletes did not compete as isolated individuals. They carried the pride and expectations of their entire cities with them. A loss could be acutely embarrassing. A victory could be weaponized in diplomacy. The atmosphere was perpetually tense. Competitors trained in full view of spectators, watched constantly by rivals and potential critics. Accusations of cheating were common. Bribery, illegal techniques, and unsportsmanlike behavior persisted, despite the stringent rules and vigilant judges. The games were sacred, but they were certainly not innocent. Yet beneath the fierce rivalry was a shared, fundamental understanding. Left-handedness, conversely, was linked to chaos, deception, and the literal act of doing things the wrong way. If you reached for an object with your left hand, someone nearby likely frowned and silently recalculated their level of trust in you. Left-handed children were often corrected early and forcefully. This correction meant actively training them out of the preference. Teachers, parents, and religious authority figures strongly encouraged the exclusive use of the right hand for writing, eating, praying, and basic daily functioning. If a child stubbornly favored the left, it was not viewed as simple preference. It was perceived as defiance or, worse, a sign of darker influence. Even essential daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Important, sanctified actions occurred on the right side. Doing anything left-handed felt inherently wrong, a violation that was both spiritual and social. Medieval logic firmly concluded that if the devil existed, and everyone agreed he did, he certainly favored the left. Left-handed knights faced particular difficulties. Sword training was entirely predicated on right-handed combat. A left-handed fighter often confused opponents, which sounds like an advantage until you realize that your own instructors deeply disliked it. Being unpredictable was suspicious. Being effective while unpredictable was even more unsettling. Medical theory offered no reprieve. Medieval scholars believed the body was morally and physically divided. The right side was strong, warm, and noble. The left side was weaker, colder, and prone to internal imbalance. If physical ailment struck, the left side was frequently blamed, simply because of course it was. Despite this relentless cultural and theological opposition, left-handed people persisted. They quietly worked, fought, cooked, and survived, utilizing the hand that felt natural. Athletes recognized one another's profound suffering. Injuries were common. Broken bones, concussions, and permanent damage were the accepted risks. To compete at Corinth meant accepting pain as an inherent part of devotion and ambition. The Isthmian Games celebrated physical excellence, but they also revealed something darker. Glory was fragile. One misstep, one stronger opponent, one unlucky moment could end everything. Still, athletes returned year after year, driven by the enduring hope that this time, Poseidon would favor their strength and the crowd would forever remember their name. The Isthmian Games were not only a contest of bodies, but of powerful voices. Alongside the athletes, poets and musicians arrived in Corinth seeking recognition in a different, equally competitive arena. Performance was intricately woven into the fabric of the festival, reinforcing the idea that excellence did not belong solely to physical strength. Song, rhythm, and verse mattered just as much. Musical competitions featured lyre players, flute performers, and singers who performed sacred hymns to the gods or epic narratives drawn from myth and history. These performances were judged publicly, and like the athletic events, they carried immense prestige. A skilled musician could gain lasting fame, especially if their performance captivated influential listeners. Music shaped the emotional rhythm of the festival, alternating between joyous celebration, mounting tension, and deep reverence. Poets used the games as a prime opportunity to test their work before vast and diverse audiences. The Isthmian Games attracted people from across the entire Greek world, making them the ideal platform for rapidly spreading new verses. A successful poem could travel far beyond Corinth, repeated by listeners as they returned home. In this way, the games functioned as a significant cultural broadcasting center long before writing reached mass audiences. Many simply mastered the art of code switching, learning to operate right-handed in public and reverting in private, a medieval form of social camouflage but for hands. So, if you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You weren't inherently evil or cursed. You were simply existing in a world that was profoundly, symbolically offended by your natural coordination. History possesses many villains. Sometimes it turns out one of them was the left hand. In the medieval world, self-awareness certainly existed, but self-reflection, at least visually, did not. This was because, for the majority of the population, mirrors were exceedingly rare, prohibitively expensive, and wildly impractical tools. Consequently, the average medieval peasant navigated life possessing only a vague, second-hand understanding of their own facial features. Glass mirrors were the ultimate luxury, owned only by powerful nobles, large monasteries, or that single, suspiciously wealthy merchant who never fully explained his income source. Polished metal mirrors did exist, but they were small, dim, distorted, and often presented a version of the user that looked permanently annoyed and slightly melted. Imagine finally catching your reflection and realizing you resemble a mildly cursed, abstract sculpture. For most people, the closest approximation of a mirror was water. Ponds, deep wells, buckets, or rivers offered momentary glimpses, instantly warped by ripples, shadows, or the immediate realization that lingering might result in drowning. One did not stare. One briefly glanced, accepted whatever vague shape stared back, and moved on. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like primarily through verbal descriptions. Other people were their mirror, and they were rarely kind. Asterisk, you have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look perpetually tired. Asterisk, this unfiltered, brutal social feedback became the mechanism for self-image. Victory odes played a particularly special role. Poets composed detailed verses praising the winning athletes, their home cities, and their generous patrons. These odes elevated athletic success into moral and civic achievement, framing victory as irrefutable proof of discipline, virtue, and divine favor. Fame did not end when the wreath was removed. It was preserved permanently through words. The very presence of poets also reinforced Corinth's status as a burgeoning cultural hub. Wealthy patrons commissioned performances to conspicuously enhance their own reputation, turning art into a highly valuable form of social currency. Applause mattered greatly, but so did who was seen applauding whom. Artistic success, much like athletic victory, depended entirely on visibility. The soundscape of the Isthmian Games was constant, overwhelming, and intense. Cheers from the stadium blended seamlessly with music, chanting, bargaining, and prayer. Sacred hymns echoed near Poseidon's sanctuary, while laughter and argument filled the surrounding grounds. Silence was a rarity in this environment. Performance was fiercely competitive by nature. Musicians and poets faced the same brutal pressures as the athletes. One chance to impress, little tolerance for failure, and no guarantee of lasting reward. Yet they returned, driven by the same potent desire for lasting recognition. The Isthmian Games proved that Greek competition extended far beyond physical dominance. Excellence possessed many forms, and in Corinth, every voice actively competed to be heard. Beyond the dedicated stadiums and sanctuaries, another competition unfolded, quieter in its tone, yet louder in its economic power and far more profitable. The Isthmian Games were a significant commercial event as much as a sacred one. Wherever large crowds gathered in the ancient world, merchants inevitably followed, and Corinth's strategic position between two seas made it a perfect, bustling marketplace. This lack of visual feedback meant personal grooming was, by necessity, approximate. Hairstyles were functional, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed based on feel, not appearance. If your hair was uneven, someone would inevitably point it out. Loudly, publicly, and with unnecessary enthusiasm. The concept of checking one's appearance before leaving the house simply did not exist. You walked outside and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed all was fine. Confidence came easier when you had no visual evidence to the contrary. Portraits offered no clarity either. Most people were never painted, and even when they were, medieval art prioritized symbolism and piety over physical accuracy. A portrait might depict you as serene, noble, and perfectly symmetrical, none of which were guaranteed in reality. This significant disconnect between identity and appearance created a strange freedom. Medieval people could not afford to be obsessed with their looks, because they literally lacked the access. Vanity required capital. Most people had neither. Therefore, medieval society judged you by your actions, your reputation, your family's standing, and whether you maintained a tolerable smell, not by your jawline or skin tone. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was rooted in survival, not selfies. And that might be the most genuine medieval flex of all. One of the strangest and least discussed realities of medieval life is the profound emotional attachment people developed toward their personal possessions. This was not attachment in the modern consumerist sense. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades, and certainly no treat-yourself mentality. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because it was essential for survival, and there was a high probability you would own that very object for the duration of your life. Naturally, people began giving these objects names. Tools were the most common recipients of this affection. Temporary stalls filled the open spaces around the sanctuary. Traders sold essential food, wine, oil, textiles, tools, perfumes, and small luxury items aimed directly at visitors eager to spend their money. Artisans offered figurines of Poseidon, miniature wreaths, and various souvenirs marking attendance at the games. Even athletes and performers became customers, purchasing necessary supplies or commissioning new equipment while they waited to compete. Money changed hands constantly. Wagers were routinely placed on the athletic events despite official disapproval. Betting added another volatile layer of tension to competitions already charged with civic pride and personal honor. Victories could enrich not only the athletes, but also those who shrewdly backed them. Losses stung just as deeply. Corinth benefited enormously from this activity. By hosting the games, the city of Corinth masterfully asserted both economic dominance and apparent piety. The city's coffers swelled with wealth drawn from taxes, harbor fees, and lodging charges. The sheer influx of visitors, all requiring ship repairs, animal housing, and replenished supplies, stimulated virtually every tier of local industry. For visiting merchants, the festival presented a unique, condensed marketplace, granting access to influential clients they might otherwise never encounter. Trade agreements were discussed casually, complex contracts negotiated over shared meals, and tentative political alliances tested through convivial conversation. The sacred setting encouraged a temporary atmosphere of trust. Business conducted under Poseidon's gaze carried a subtle implication of honesty, even if reality often fell disappointingly short. The visible entanglement of commerce and ritual invariably disturbed some observers. Philosophers complained that the relentless pursuit of profit fatally distracted from true piety, while moralists warned that greed actively polluted the sacred space. A shovel was never just a shovel. It was the shovel, the one that helped you weather winters, cultivate the fields, bury your deceased relatives, and occasionally chase off aggressive livestock. When an object performs that much emotional labor, it earns a name. Axes, plows, knives, and even cooking pots were regularly referred to as if they were long-suffering co-workers rather than inanimate property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, and shields routinely bore names, sometimes grand and serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that saved your life in battle was not simply metal. It was a loyal companion. Breaking it was not merely inconvenient. It was genuinely tragic. People didn't say, "My sword snapped." They said, "I lost him." But this practice did not stop at tools. Ovens were named. Doors had monikers. Bells were personalized. If an object was central to daily survival, it quickly crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that reliably produced good bread was praised profusely. One that failed its duties was publicly and repeatedly insulted in front of others. This behavior wasn't necessarily superstition. It was intense practicality blended with emotional exhaustion. When your entire existence hinged on a handful of objects functioning correctly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them, blamed them, and sincerely thanked them. Medieval people lived precariously, and anthropomorphizing a shovel was arguably healthier than screaming into the cosmic void. There was also a clear legal dimension. Named objects frequently appeared in wills. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife, but the good one. Everyone knew exactly which object was intended. Possessions carried memory, reputation, and history. To lose one was to lose a physical piece of one's identity. Even repairs carried significant emotional weight. A patch tool was not inferior. It was experienced. Scars denoted reliability. Yet, these criticisms rarely managed to slow the activity. The games had always been inextricably linked with trade, and Corinth embraced that identity unapologetically. Crowds flowed constantly between spectacular events and opportunistic shopping. A wrestling match might conclude, sending spectators rushing toward food stalls or shaded tents selling exotic goods. Poetic performances drew absorbed listeners who then drifted toward merchants selling writing tablets or decorated scrolls. The entire festival pulsed with relentless economic motion. The Isthmian Games revealed an essential truth about ancient Greek life. Religion, competition, and commerce were not discrete, isolated spheres. They reinforced one another. Sacred celebration drew immense crowds. Crowds fueled trade. And trade ultimately strengthened the city that hosted the god. In Corinth, Poseidon was honored not only with sacrifices and songs but with thriving markets that proved his favor in unmistakable financial terms. The Isthmian Games brought together thousands of individuals who would otherwise never meet peacefully. Citizens of rival cities, soldiers on leave, sailors arriving from distant ports, wealthy elites, and the poor, all converged upon the same sacred ground. While the festival promised unity, it inherently generated tension. Conflict inevitably followed where such crowds gathered. In theory, the games were protected by a sacred truce. **Ekakeria**. Travelers were meant to pass safely, and all open hostilities were discouraged during the festival period. This expectation permitted competitors and spectators from hostile states to stand side by side without immediate violence. Though the truce was not always formally declared, the religious weight of Poseidon's sanctuary commanded a powerful expectation of restraint. In practice, however, that restraint was fragile. Old grudges did not simply vanish because a festival had begun. A tool that had been fixed a dozen times had proven its worth and deserved to stay. In a world defined by having few possessions, each one mattered immensely. So, medieval people didn't merely own objects. They lived with them, labored alongside them, and sometimes cursed them like old friends who stubbornly refused to cooperate. Honestly, naming your shovel makes perfect sense when your shovel is the primary reason you are still alive. In the medieval world, shoes were not items of fashion. They were not accessories. They were not something you casually owned 3 pairs of just in case. Shoes were essential survival equipment, and losing one was less a minor blunder and more an existential threat that could genuinely ruin your year. Leather was expensive. Skilled labor was expensive. Every element involved in shoemaking required time, animals, and a cobbler who likely possessed very strong opinions and limited patience. As a direct result, most common people owned precisely 1 pair of shoes. One. And that singular pair was expected to withstand muddy fields, sharp stones, animal waste, bitter winter frost, oppressive summer heat, and whatever mysterious, unsavory liquids medieval streets routinely offered without explanation. So, instead of replacement, people practiced constant, meticulous repair. Soles were stitched, restitched, patched, layered, and reinforced until the original shoe was less a piece of footwear and more a historical artifact. A mature medieval shoe might contain leather from 3 different animals, repairs spanning multiple decades, and enough stitching to qualify as a specialized textile thesis. Cobblers were ubiquitous and deeply respected. Their profession was not glamorous, but it was absolutely essential. A skilled cobbler could extend the life of a shoe for years, sometimes decades. And if you were fortunate enough to find one who worked quickly and didn't judge you for the terrible smell, you maintained that loyalty forever. Boasting, drunkenness, and unsettled wagers easily reignited rivalries. Arguments over athletic results or accusations of cheating could escalate alarmingly quickly. Judges worked constantly to prevent verbal disputes from turning physical. Crowd behavior played a pivotal role. Victories were celebrated loudly, sometimes provocatively. Supporters shouted the names of their cities, transforming personal wins into potent political statements. Defeats could spark deep resentment, especially if the outcome seemed unfair. The emotional intensity of competition magnified every slight. Security relied far more on social pressure than on physical force. There was no standing police presence capable of controlling such massive crowds. Instead, a collective fear of offending the god, public shame, and the risk of swift collective retaliation kept most disputes contained. Violence did occur, but engaging in it was dangerous for all involved. Alcohol flowed freely. Wine dulled restraint and sharpened tempers. Nighttime gatherings, often removed from the formal spaces of the sanctuary, were especially volatile. The line between celebration and chaos was perpetually thin. Yet, despite these risks, the games rarely collapsed into full disorder. The shared recognition that this space was sacred ultimately mattered. People fundamentally wanted the festival to continue. They wanted to return home safely. Mutual self-interest reinforced the religious obligation. The Isthmian Games thus revealed how profoundly delicate peace could be in the ancient Greek world. Unity was possible, but it was temporary. It required ritual, spectacle, and constant, careful negotiation. For a few days, Poseidon's authority held rival cities in check. Once the crowds dispersed, old conflicts promptly resumed. But the memory of standing together remained, however briefly. Over time, the Isthmian Games adapted. Shoes were so intrinsically valuable that they frequently appeared in wills. Parents passed them down to children. Older siblings inherited footwear that had already endured far too much. Breaking in new shoes wasn't painful because they were pristine. It was often painful because they were someone else's well-worn, hardened cast-offs. And heaven help you if a shoe failed completely during the winter. Bare feet on frozen ground was not an inconvenience. It was life-threatening. Frostbite did not concern itself with your financial standing. Consequently, people wrapped their feet in cloth, straw, or any available material until the cobbler could perform his necessary magic. This reality also dictated the way medieval people walked. Carefully, deliberately. Every step was considered. You did not sprint unless you were being chased by something worse than losing a shoe. You avoided puddles, not for reasons of cleanliness, but for shoe preservation. In a world devoid of cheap replacements, durability was everything. Shoes were not disposable. They were managed, cherished, maintained, and occasionally argued with. So when you visualize medieval life, remember this: those worn-out, misshapen shoes were not merely signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility and endurance. If your shoes lasted, you were successfully navigating the world. One quiet terror haunted medieval life more profoundly than warfare, famine, or even epidemic disease: the fear of being utterly forgotten. Dying was expected. Being erased was unbearable. In an era lacking photographs, recordings, and widespread written documentation, human memory was fragile and fleeting. If no one remembered you, it was fundamentally as if you had never existed. And medieval people found this concept deeply unsettling. Eternity was long and reputation was short. The mathematics simply did not work out. This is why society became obsessed with names. As Greek political power fractured and new rulers emerged, the festival evolved rather than disappeared. Macedonian kings and later Roman authorities quickly recognized the strategic value of the games as a potent tool of influence. Control of the Isthmian Games meant access to Greek prestige, tradition, and public loyalty. Under Roman rule, the games continued largely intact. Romans understood spectacle perfectly. They supported the festival, funded repairs to the sanctuaries, and sometimes personally presided over the ceremonies. Participation expanded far beyond the Greek world. Athletes, performers, and spectators arrived from across the burgeoning empire, transforming the Isthmian Games into a truly international event. This expansion altered the festival's character. Competition intensified, but commercialization deepened significantly. Wealthy Roman patrons sponsored events to display their generosity and secure public favor. Roman officials used the games as stages for imperial announcements and political theater. Sacred tradition remained, but it now shared space with overt imperial authority. Some Greeks viewed these changes with suspicion, worrying that Roman involvement diluted the festival's religious seriousness. Others welcomed the stability and resources Rome provided. The games survived precisely because they could serve new masters without losing their core identity rooted in competition and ritual. The physical landscape evolved as well. Infrastructure improved. Roads, seating, and facilities expanded to accommodate larger crowds. Corinth itself was rebuilt and repopulated after Roman destruction, and the games played a vital role in restoring its prominence. Poseidon's sanctuary remained central, anchoring continuity amid this rapid transformation. Eventually, however, as Christianity spread and pagan festivals declined, the Isthmian Games faded. Without state support or religious centrality, they could not survive. Yet their influence endured. Children were named after parents, grandparents, revered saints, and occasionally that one tolerable uncle who deserved another chance at remembrance. Naming was not an act of creativity. It was an act of archival preservation. You weren't simply honoring someone. You were actively keeping them alive through mandatory repetition. Gravestones, when they were used, held enormous importance. Even the most minimal marker, a rough cross, a scratched name, a carved symbol, was a clear declaration. Asterisk, I was here. I mattered enough to warrant a memory. Asterisk, if one could not afford stone, memory was forced to do the heavy lifting. Stories became the tombstones that you carried inside your head. This profound fear also explains the medieval adoration of witnesses. Contracts were always spoken aloud. Promises were made publicly in groups. Important events had to be communal. If enough people saw something happen, it achieved reality. If no one saw it, it might as well have never occurred. Privacy was not romantic. It was perilous. Church records existed in part for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, and deaths were meticulously logged, not merely for divine accountability, but for permanence. Being written down ensured stability. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into the mud of history. Even medieval charity had a memory component. Donating to a church frequently came with one crucial request. Asterisk, say my name in your prayers. Asterisk, that was not spiritual vanity. That was existential insurance. As long as someone, somewhere, spoke your name aloud, you were not truly gone. Ironically, this obsession worked. Centuries later, we still know the names of relatively ordinary people precisely because they were stubborn enough to leave marks, records, symbols, or stories behind. Medieval people did not chase fame. They chased remembrance. They lived knowing their time was short, their world unstable, and history inherently forgetful. The enduring idea of combining sport, culture, commerce, and identity in one grand event shaped countless later public festivals. The Isthmian Games remind us that the ancient world profoundly understood spectacle. These were not merely athletic contests. They were instruments of unity, competition, diplomacy, and belief. Held between two seas, the games connected people across boundaries of city-state, language, and empire. Long after the cheers faded, the underlying model remained. Wherever crowds gathered to compete, celebrate, and trade under shared symbols, the spirit of the Corinthian games lives on. What ultimately made the Isthmian Games important was not any single race, song, or sacrifice, but the sophisticated way all these elements merged into a shared experience. For the Greeks, the games served as a constant reminder of who they were when divisions were temporarily set aside. City-states that fought bitter wars could still recognize one another as participants in the same sacred tradition. The Isthmian Games offered a controlled space for rivalry. Competition replaced warfare, at least briefly. Athletes battled instead of armies. Poets offered praise instead of political propaganda. Even commerce softened conflict by binding rivals through shared profit. This framework did not end violence in the Greek world, but it provided an alternative, sophisticated language for prestige and honor. Memory played a crucial role. Victories were remembered long after the festival ended. Names of champions circulated through stories, inscriptions, and poetry. Cities remembered who triumphed and who failed. These memories deeply shaped identity. A single victory could define a lifetime, and a single disgrace could linger for generations. The games also taught invaluable lessons about order. Rules, judges, rituals, and sacred boundaries all reinforced the idea that competition required rigorous structure. And they fought that reality the only way they knew how, by ensuring someone somewhere remembered their name, which is why we are discussing them now. In the modern world, silence is marketed as a supreme luxury. People invest in noise-canceling technology, book expensive silent retreats, and proudly announce that they desperately need some quiet time. Medieval people, conversely, heard silence and immediately concluded that something had gone terribly, spiritually wrong. A silent medieval home was not peaceful. It was deeply suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, hacking coughs, prayers muttered under the breath, animals shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home suddenly went quiet, it suggested severe illness, recent death, or the presence of something supernatural that preferred not to be noticed. And medieval people were intensely uncomfortable with anything that preferred not to be noticed. This fear was rooted in religious anxiety. Silence was associated with the grave, the afterlife, and the terrifying unknown. Churches purposefully echoed, filling the space with chanting, bells, and communal prayer. Bells rang almost constantly, for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes simply because someone decided the gathering silence was starting to get ideas. Homes operated on the same logic. People spoke while they worked, sang while they cooked, and prayed out loud. Even when truly alone, many people muttered to themselves, not because they were eccentric, but because being audibly present felt inherently safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was particularly menacing. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and generalized theological anxiety. Add silence, and you created the perfect environment for imagining footsteps, spectral whispers, or divine judgment creeping up behind you. Strength without restraint was deemed dangerous. Skill without respect for the gods was meaningless. The festival balanced chaos and control, reminding participants that excellence demanded discipline. For Corinth, the games became deeply embedded in the civic identity. Hosting the Isthmian Games declared the city's importance to the entire Greek world. Even after political fortunes shifted, the memory of the festival reinforced Corinth's role as an essential meeting point of cultures, trade, and ideas. In later centuries, writers looked back on the Isthmian Games as symbols of a shared past. They represented a time when Greek identity was expressed not through conquest alone, but through excellence, creativity, and ritual. The games were idealized even as their complex realities were forgotten. What survived was the powerful idea that large gatherings could shape culture, that sport, art, and belief could reinforce one another, and that shared spectacle could momentarily overcome profound division. The Isthmian Games mattered because they revealed how ancient societies understood power, not only through force, but through participation. To attend was to belong. To compete was to be seen. And for a brief moment between two seas, The Greek world gathered to watch itself perform. The end of the Isthmian Games did not arrive with a final trumpet blast or a remembered champion. It came quietly, as traditions often do, worn down gradually rather than destroyed in a single event. As the ancient world fundamentally changed, the foundations that had sustained the games slowly eroded. Religion, politics, and public life no longer aligned in the way they once had. The greatest shift was religious. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, festivals dedicated to the old gods lost their meaning and protection. Poseidon's sanctuary, once vibrant with sacrifice and song, became an artifact of a fading belief system. A crackling fire, even a small one, was a comfort, not just for warmth, but for the sound. That gentle noise reassured you that the material world was still functioning. This also explains medieval communal sleeping habits. People did not sleep together merely for warmth. They slept together because shared breathing, shifting, and the occasional snore created a protective soundscape that actively pushed back against the void. A room full of audible noise meant no one had died quietly during the night, which was always a recurring concern. Even monasteries, famous for their vows of silence, structured it meticulously. Silence wasn't the total absence of sound. It was regulated, ritualized, and heavily supervised. Unplanned silence, that was unsettling. To medieval ears, silence was not calm, healing, or restful. It was a definitive warning. And in a world where danger was constant and explanations were limited, making noise was one of the easiest ways to reaffirm that you were still alive. If medieval people seemed loud, repetitive, or annoyingly chatty, remember they weren't filling space. They were diligently keeping the darkness away. In medieval society, hair was never simply hair. It was a potent statement, a social semaphore, a resume, and occasionally a genuine problem requiring immediate spiritual intervention. What sprouted from your scalp mattered far more than modern people can grasp, because medieval culture believed hair carried inherent moral, social, and sometimes supernatural meaning. Long hair could signal status, personal freedom, or deliberate rebellion. It could also signal that one had not yet been properly humbled or punished. Knights wore their hair with intention. Nobles styled it to display aristocratic standing. Monks shaved it completely to signify religious devotion. And women's hair was treated almost like a dangerous, volatile substance that required constant restraint. Without the god at the center, the games lost their sacred authority. Competition without divine purpose felt hollow, even dangerous, to the new religious order. State support disappeared as well. Roman officials who had once sponsored and exploited the games for prestige now turned their attention elsewhere. Resources were redirected. Infrastructure decayed. Without money, organization, and official endorsement, large gatherings became impossible to sustain. The crowds stopped coming. Cultural memory lingered longer than the festival itself. Writers referenced the Isthmian Games as symbols of an earlier age, a time when cities met in competition rather than constant war. Victories were still remembered even when the stadium stood empty. The idea of the games thus outlived the reality. The silence that followed was profound. A space once filled with shouting crowds, music, bargaining, and prayer returned to quiet. Pine trees grew where spectators once gathered. Stone structures weathered. The movement that had defined the isthmus slowed, though it never truly stopped. Yet, disappearance does not equate to failure. The Isthmian Games succeeded precisely because they were not eternal. They reflected the values of their time. Belief in the gods, pride in the body, respect for skill, and fascination with public spectacle. When those values shifted, the games no longer belonged. What remains is enduring influence. Modern sporting events, festivals, and international competitions still echo the Isthmian model. The blending of sport, culture, commerce, and identity continues. Crowds still gather for shared experience. Cities still seek prestige through spectacle. The Isthmian Games ended, but their purpose did not vanish. They remind us that civilizations express themselves not only through laws and wars, but through the moments when they come together to compete, celebrate, and be seen, if only for a little while. Loose hair on a woman was associated with raw sexuality, social disorder, or emotional instability. Respectable women covered their hair, not primarily for warmth, but because medieval society was deeply nervous about the moral chaos that might ensue if it were unrestrained. A strand of hair escaping a veil was often treated like a scandal in progress. The act of hair cutting itself was deeply symbolic. Having your hair forcibly cut against your will was a punishment, a public removal of dignity. Criminals, prisoners, and disgraced individuals frequently had their heads shaved to mark their shame. It was not just humiliation, it was symbolic identity theft. You ceased to look like yourself, and everyone knew exactly why. Religious life took hair rituals seriously. Monks shaved the crown of their head into the famous tonsure, creating a distinct bald circle that silently announced, "I belong to God." This specific haircut required fastidious maintenance, meaning monks were constantly reshaving the same awkward bald spot just in case the Almighty was checking. Even beards carried tremendous meaning. A beard could symbolize wisdom, mature masculinity, or authority. Shaving one off could be a calculated insult, a challenge, or a profound emotional declaration. Medieval men did not shave casually. They shaved with intent. Finally, there was the pervasive fear of hair falling into the wrong hands. Hair could be used in charms, curses, or various forms of folk magic. People genuinely believed that a strand carried a piece of your vital essence. Losing hair was not merely cosmetic. It was spiritually risky. Throwing it away carelessly was seen as an open invitation to someone with malicious intentions and too much idle time. So, medieval people guarded their hair, controlled it, shaped it, and judged others by it relentlessly. Hair was not decoration or personal expression. It was latent power sitting on your scalp, daring you to manage it correctly. For the Romans, wine was not merely an indulgence reserved for celebration. It was a constant, essential presence woven into the daily routine, religious ritual, and social identity. Soldiers received wine as part of their rations. Laborers drank it to dull exhaustion. Elites discussed its nuances with the seriousness usually reserved for politics and philosophy. Even children encountered wine early, heavily diluted with water, learning its taste long before adulthood. To live in the Roman world was to live surrounded by wine. Rome did not invent winemaking, but it transformed it into a vast imperial system. Wherever Roman power expanded, vines inevitably followed. Veterans were settled on conquered land and actively encouraged to plant vineyards. Provinces were reshaped not only by roads and forts but by trellised hillsides and cultivated valleys. From the cooler regions of Gaul to the sun-baked landscapes of Syria, Roman viticulture adapted to local conditions while simultaneously imposing standardized practices. Wine became a critical marker of Roman presence. If wine was being produced successfully, Rome had truly arrived. This massive expansion was supported by careful observation. Roman agricultural writers treated viticulture as a technical, exacting discipline. They recorded soil quality, slope orientation, pruning schedules, and harvest timing with meticulous attention. Different grape varieties were carefully matched to different climates. Failures were analyzed. Successes were copied. Wine production was never left to chance. It was strategically engineered. Wine also functioned as a powerful social signal. Quality mattered deeply. A host's reputation could rise or fall based on the vintage poured at dinner. Serving an aged wine demonstrated immense wealth and patience. Serving cheap or poorly stored wine suggested carelessness or outright insult. Even among ordinary Romans, preferences existed. Not all wine was equal, and everyone held strong opinions. And if you failed, someone would definitely have an opinion. Medieval people did not believe all days were created equal. Some days were considered blessed, spiritually cooperative, and productive. Others were deeply suspicious. And if you attempted anything important on the wrong day, medieval logic concluded that whatever failure ensued was entirely your fault for neglecting to check the calendar first. These unlucky days weren't rare exceptions. They were pervasive. Certain weekdays, specific saints' days, fasting days, various astrological alignments, and vague traditionally bad dates were all considered dangerously unsuitable for particular activities. The medieval world was governed by a tyranny of time, where the calendar dictated not just planning, but survival. There were specific days deemed unsuitable for marriage, travel, bloodletting, planting crops, or even cutting your hair. A procedure avoided because hair was believed to physically retain memories and influences. Medical guides were clear. Performing procedures on the wrong day was reckless, often resulting in worse outcomes than the illness itself. Surgeons, before ever touching a patient, consulted calendars whose dates were derived from a volatile mix of astrology, ancestral superstition, and sheer vibe. This cosmic scheduling permeated every facet of life. Farmers rigorously adhered to this logic, fearing that planting on an unlucky day risked guaranteed poor harvests, divine wrath, or devastating storms. If the crops failed, the date, not the weather, was the culprit. Marriage was particularly fraught. Couples frequently postponed ceremonies for weeks, delaying bliss simply because the astrological moment was deemed unsupportive. Imagine the difficulty of explaining to your betrothed's family that your love is profound, but the celestial bodies are currently unavailable for commitment. Even basic travel was perilous. Yet, despite this widespread obsession, Roman attitudes toward wine emphasized control. Drinking wine undiluted was universally considered barbaric, a sign of surrendering reason. Proper Romans mixed wine with water, balancing pleasure with necessary restraint. Excess was mocked and feared, even if it was practiced quietly behind closed doors. This contradiction defined Roman wine culture. Wine was ubiquitous, deeply loved, and endlessly discussed, yet always surrounded by strict rules. It was both a daily necessity and a moral test. In mastering wine, Romans believed they demonstrated mastery over themselves, their land, and the vast empire that carried their vineyards from one horizon to the next. Once wine became central to Roman life, controlling its production became a matter of imperial importance. Vineyards were not planted randomly. They followed the lines of expansion, settlement, and military strategy. Land granted to veterans was often ideal for viticulture, ensuring both economic stability and cultural continuity. A province that produced wine could support itself and export surplus back into Rome's extensive trade networks. Romans studied the land carefully before planting vines. Hillsides were preferred, especially those with good sun exposure and natural drainage. Soil was tested by touch and smell. Poor land might grow grain, but good land was reserved for vines. Vineyards demanded patience. Years passed before full production began, and only stable regions could sustain that investment. This made viticulture a quiet, powerful declaration of long-term control. Different regions developed distinct reputations. Wines from Italy were initially prized, especially those from Campania and Latium. Over time, however, provincial wines from Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa gained widespread recognition. Success was not immediate. Early provincial wines were often mocked as crude, but Roman methods improved them significantly. Setting out on a black day invited mysterious misfortune. Accidents, broken axles, or encounters with bandits. A sudden bad omen, a tripping step, an unexpected sneeze, or the wrong bird cry was often enough to send travelers retreating home, confirming that the universe had sent a clear, non-negotiable message. Not today. The deepest irony lay in the psychological consequence. This communal belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people expected a day to be ruined by ill fortune, they became acutely tuned to negative outcomes, noticing and magnifying every minor setback. A bad day was bad because everyone agreed to treat it as such. Calendars thus functioned as survival manuals, offering the illusion of control in a brutally unpredictable world. If disaster struck, at least one could console themselves. I knew better than to trust that Tuesday. Medieval individuals didn't just plan their lives. They were constantly negotiating with time itself, and time, more often than not, remained deeply unimpressed. In the medieval mindset, a sneeze transcended mere biological reflex. It was an event, a momentary spiritual emergency that demanded immediate, verbal intervention from anyone within earshot. This urgency stemmed from a simple, deeply unsettling piece of folklore. Sneezing was believed to be the soul briefly considering an escape from the body. The physical act created a split second of profound vulnerability. The body convulsed, the breath halted, the eyes squeezed shut, a momentary lapse of control. And any vacuum, any gap in human command, was viewed by medieval theology as an open invitation for malicious spirits, demons, or general bad luck to either exit the body or, terrifyingly, move in. This is where the blessing became essential. Uttering, "God bless you," was never mere courtesy. It was active damage control. A spoken seal quickly slammed shut before anything invisible and malevolent could exploit the situation. Pruning techniques, grafting, and selective harvesting steadily raised quality. Labor was relentless. Vineyards required constant, grueling attention. Slaves performed the majority of the work, supervised by estate managers who tracked yields obsessively. Seasonal rhythms ruled life. Pruning in winter, training the vines in spring, and harvesting in autumn. Mistakes ruined entire vintages. Discipline was paramount. Wine production also fostered major infrastructure. Roads connected estates to ports. Storage facilities multiplied. Amphora workshops appeared near vineyards, producing ceramic containers specifically designed for transport. Every stage of production fueled the economy, making wine one of Rome's most valuable commodities, moving in vast quantities across the Mediterranean. Yet, expansion carried inherent risks. Overproduction of wine threatened the essential grain supply. Some emperors restricted the planting of new vineyards, fearing farmers would abandon food crops for more profitable grapes. These laws revealed just how widespread viticulture had become. Wine was profitable, but grain was essential for survival. By the height of the empire, vineyards formed a detailed web that mirrored Roman authority. To drink wine in a distant province was to participate in a system shaped by Roman planning, slave labor, and control. Wine traveled where the legions had gone, and its presence confirmed that Roman order had taken root deeply enough to grow something that required patience, stability, and time. When harvest season arrived, vineyards became sites of intense, focused activity. Timing mattered more than force. Grapes harvested too early produced sharp, thin wine. Grapes left too long risked rot or loss to birds. Estate managers watched the vines carefully, judging readiness by color, sweetness, and texture. The decision to harvest was irreversible. Once grapes were cut, the year's work was locked in. Harvesting was manual and exhausting. Being left unblessed after a sneeze was genuinely alarming, signaling that your exposed soul might be unsupervised. Sneezing during crucial moments was particularly concerning. A sudden spasm during a prayer was suspicious. During a wedding, deeply unfortunate. And during the signing of a contract or the taking of a vow, potentially catastrophic. Some people would halt the proceedings entirely, waiting for the moment of perceived interruption to pass before daring to continue. Medical beliefs compounded this anxiety. Certain medieval thinkers hypothesized that sneezing expelled air directly connected to the heart or brain. Too many sneezes implied physical weakness, too few indicated dangerous internal blockage, and sneezing at the wrong time signaled that fate itself was speaking, and fate was seldom delivering good news. There were even elaborate interpretations based on direction. A sneeze to the right might be favorable, but one to the left was highly questionable. Repeated sneezing strongly suggested a curse, a draft, or a combination of both. In an impressive feat of demanding the impossible, children were warned not to sneeze carelessly. Parents scolded youngsters for failing to cover their mouths, not due to concerns about hygiene, but because open sneezing increased the area of spiritual exposure. Medieval parenting was objectively intense. Since sneezing was unavoidable, medieval daily life was characterized by a constant, low-level anxiety that one's own nose might betray the soul at the worst possible moment. Therefore, when someone offered a blessing, it wasn't genuine kindness. It was pure panic expertly wrapped in social courtesy. A medieval sneeze was never rude, it was profoundly risky. Wigs and symbolic portraiture, Elizabeth I constructed an image of timeless authority. This manufactured beauty was a critical political performance, designed both to reassure her subjects and to deter international rivals. Workers cut grape clusters by hand, piling them into baskets and carrying them to the pressing areas. Speed was critical. Grapes spoiled quickly once detached from the vine. Pressing often began the same day, sometimes immediately in the fields. Pressing was done either with feet or by heavy wooden presses. Workers crushed grapes in shallow vats, allowing juice to flow into collection basins. This initial, light pressing produced the best wine. Later pressings, involving heavier pressure, yielded lower quality liquid used for everyday consumption or for slaves. Nothing was wasted. Fermentation occurred naturally. Yeast present on grape skins transformed sugar into alcohol, a process understood empirically rather than scientifically. But Roman vintners recognized the patterns. Temperature mattered, so containers were kept in cool, shaded areas. Frothing signaled success. Off smells warned of failure. Winemaking required accumulated experience more than abstract theory. Juice was transferred into large clay containers, *dolia*, often partially buried in the ground to regulate temperature. These vessels allowed slow fermentation and settling. Sediment sank to the bottom, clarifying the liquid above. Vintners tasted regularly, adjusting methods when possible. The entire process was risky. Entire harvests could spoil. Mold, excessive heat, or contamination ruined the wine. Failure meant severe economic loss and social embarrassment. Success brought reputation and profit. Harvest time was also communal. Songs, prayers, and offerings accompanied the work, blending hard labor with necessary ritual. The gods were thanked before and after, reinforcing the belief that human effort alone was insufficient. Roman wine was generally not refined by modern standards. It was rough, variable, and deeply influenced by environment. Yet, it was the product of immense labor and accumulated knowledge. Each cup represented months of attention and years of experience. For a queen in Tudor England, aging, weakening, or even changing naturally was strictly forbidden. Their physical existence was effectively state property. Beauty was a double-edged sword. It granted elevation but imposed a relentless trap, transforming their physical appearance into central policy and a critical matter of national security. In Tudor society, a woman's beauty was invariably assigned an expiration date. Youth was cherished, maturity was grudgingly tolerated, and aging was met with quiet dread. While men were permitted to accumulate authority, wisdom, and respect with the passing years, women were expected to artificially preserve the facade of youth long after it had genuinely faded. The process of aging was not treated as a natural consequence of time, but as a severe personal failure. The physical markers of age, wrinkles, thinning hair, weight fluctuations, and dental decay, carried significant social consequences, read as clear evidence of declining worth. An older woman's appearance was seldom reframed as dignity or experience. Instead, she risked being rendered invisible or, worse, becoming an object of suspicion. Youth suggested desirable traits like fertility and pliability. Age, conversely, implied independence, accumulated memory, and influence, qualities that inevitably destabilized the male-dominated Tudor establishment. This cultural anxiety weighed particularly heavily upon elite women, whose value had often been predicated upon marriage prospects and fertility, both assets that rapidly dwindled with age. Once a woman moved past her childbearing years, her social leverage weakened dramatically. Though widows sometimes managed to reclaim a degree of authority through inherited wealth or robust family connections, their appearance remained perpetually subject to commentary. A widow who dressed too lavishly risked public ridicule. One who dressed too plainly risked outright irrelevance. Behind every amphora stood hands stained with juice, feet purple from pressing, and a system that turned fragile fruit into a substance that defined Roman life. Once fermentation settled, wine entered its longest and most uncertain phase: storage. Romans did not bottle wine as we know it. Instead, they relied on clay amphorae, tall ceramic vessels sealed with resin or pitch. These containers fundamentally shaped how wine tasted, aged, and survived transport across the empire. Amphorae were porous. Air slowly passed through their walls, allowing the wine to change over time. This made aging possible but often unpredictable. Some wines improved with age, developing complexity and smoothness. Others turned sour or spoiled. Aging was an experiment repeated year after year, guided by memory rather than precise measurement. To control this process, amphorae were often stored in cool cellars or partially buried in the ground. Sealing was critical. Resin, wax, or oil prevented excessive oxidation and contamination. The strong smell of pitch became permanently associated with the wine itself, profoundly influencing the taste. Roman wine rarely tasted clean by modern standards. It carried earthy, smoky, and sometimes medicinal notes. Labels were scratched or painted onto the vessels, recording the estate, the vintage, and sometimes the consul in office that year. This allowed wines to be dated and compared. Aged wine became a powerful status symbol. Serving an old vintage demonstrated substantial wealth, storage capacity, and patience. Time itself became a luxury commodity. Transportation posed further challenges. Amphorae were stacked tightly in ship holds, secured with ropes and clay. Breakage was common. Leaks ruined cargo. Shipwrecks scattered amphorae across the seafloor, where many still lie today. Wine was valuable but inherently fragile. Different wines aged differently. Some were meant to be consumed quickly. Others improved over decades. Consequently, cosmetics, wigs, and fashionable attire evolved into crucial tools of resistance. Older women utilized them not merely to preserve beauty but, more urgently, to stave off social disappearance. The same practices that were harshly condemned in younger women were often quietly tolerated in their elders, provided that a rigid sense of decorum was maintained. A carefully constructed illusion of youth, however fragile, was vastly preferred over the visible reality of aging. Yet this effort was profoundly exhausting. Women lived with a constant, draining awareness that time was fundamentally working against them. Every passing year carried the tangible risk of becoming less desirable, less influential, and ultimately less protected. Aging women were frequently caricatured using malicious stereotypes, portrayed as bitter, lustful, or manipulative narratives that conveniently justified their subsequent marginalization. The feared figure of the old woman, a persistent warning of what happened when beauty failed to shield femininity, perpetually hovered at the edge of Tudor culture. For queens and noble women, aging carried distinct political dangers. A queen past her fertile prime might be deemed a dead end for dynastic aspirations. Advisors and rivals scrutinized their appearance for any sign of decline, using physical state as a proxy for political usefulness. Elizabeth I's elaborate visual control was a direct and necessary response to this pervasive fear. She systematically refused to allow age to become visible because visibility instantly invited challenge. In Tudor England, aging systematically stripped women of the protection that beauty had provided. What remained was raw vulnerability. Unless a woman could successfully replace fading beauty with accumulated authority, commanding wealth or careful invisibility, the power granted by appearance was always conditional, and time would relentlessly reclaim it. Roman writers debated ideal aging times passionately. Opinions varied, but there was consensus that skill and luck mattered equally. Aging also blurred the line between wine and medicine. Older wines were believed to possess significant health benefits. They were prescribed for digestion, wounds, and fevers. Taste often mattered less than perceived effect. Through the amphora, wine became a great traveler. It carried regional flavors across vast distances, allowing a drinker in Rome to taste Hispania, Gaul, or the eastern provinces. Wine aged not only in clay but in motion, shaped by time, transport, and chance. In Roman hands, aging was less about perfection than transformation. The amphora captured wine at one moment and released it years later as something changed. Unpredictable, prized, and inseparable from the empire that carried it. Roman wine rarely tasted the way modern drinkers expect. Pure grape flavor was typically not the goal. Instead, Romans treated wine as a base, something to be shaped, improved, and corrected. Flavoring was common, deliberate, and deeply tied to Roman ideas of taste, medicine, and status. Honey was the most popular additive. Mixed with wine, it created mulsum, a sweet drink often served at the start of meals. Honey softened harsh flavors and made young or poor quality wine more pleasant. Serving mulsums signaled hospitality and refinement. It was not considered cheating, but skilled enhancement. Herbs and spices followed. Rosemary, thyme, bay leaves, cinnamon, pepper, and even saffron appeared in various recipes. Some were added for flavor, others for supposed health benefits. Wine was believed to carry medicinal properties, and additives enhanced its effects. Taste and therapy constantly overlapped. More surprising ingredients existed as well. Sea water was sometimes added deliberately. This stabilized the wine and altered the flavor, giving it a sharp, mineral edge. In Tudor England, a woman's appearance was never considered morally neutral. Striking beauty attracted admiration, but it simultaneously invited intense suspicion. A woman who was noticeably attractive risked being perceived not merely as fortunate, but as inherently dangerous. Her looks were interpreted as weapons, either deliberately sharpened by cunning or divinely suspect, capable of leading men towards moral ruin. This deep suspicion was rooted in long-standing religious and cultural dogma. Female beauty was consistently associated with temptation, deception, and social disorder. Sermons and moral tracts warned obsessively that a woman's face could unman a man, distracting him from duty and pulling him towards sin. Beauty, therefore, was not simply a quality a woman possessed. It was a powerful force she was expected to strictly control for the benefit of society. When public scandals erupted, appearance often determined the allocation of blame. If a woman faced accusations of adultery, manipulation, or excessive ambition, her beauty was instantly cited as corroborating evidence. Attractive women were often assumed to be more sexually available and morally unstable, whereas plain women were typically ignored rather than condemned. Beauty granted women visibility, and visibility made them exponentially vulnerable. This brutal dynamic played out most dramatically at the royal court. Anne Boleyn's renowned charm and elegance, once celebrated, were viciously reframed as seduction once her political utility waned. Her intellect suddenly became cunning, her confidence transformed into arrogance. Her beauty, which had elevated her to the throne, was swiftly recast as proof of her innate ability to corrupt the king. The very attributes that had secured her rise were later deployed to justify her destruction. Even outside the court, moral suspicion rigidly tracked women. To Roman palates, this was not strange. It reflected the empire's maritime identity. Salt preserved, seawater corrected imbalance. What sounds unpleasant today was once considered sophisticated. Resin, already present from amphor seals, became a permanent part of the flavor profile. Rather than remove it, Romans embraced it. The line between storage artifact and intended taste was thin. Wine absorbed its container, its environment, and its treatment. Experimentation was constant. Estate owners closely guarded their best recipes. Success brought reputation. Failure brought ridicule. Taste was subjective, but consensus formed around what was fashionable. Trends shifted. What one generation admired, the next mocked. Quality mattered. Flavoring could improve mediocre wine, but excessive manipulation signaled low status. The elite claimed to prefer subtle enhancement, even when indulging heavily. Moderation was praised, even if rarely practiced. These practices reveal something essential about Roman culture. Wine was not sacred in its raw state. It was meant to be worked, adjusted, and perfected through human intervention. Nature provided the grapes. Romans provided the order. In shaping wine's taste, Romans expressed their broader worldview. Civilization meant control. Refinement meant improvement. And wine, endlessly altered and debated, became a canvas for Roman identity. Layered, ambitious, and never satisfied with leaving things as they were. Despite their national enthusiasm for wine, Romans believed firmly that how one drank mattered more than how much. Drinking wine undiluted was considered dangerous, uncivilized, and morally suspect. To consume wine straight was associated with foreigners, especially Greeks of poor reputation and the northern barbarians. A proper Roman always mixed wine with water. Dilution took place directly at the table. Wine was poured into a large mixing bowl, the crater, and water was added according to custom and context. A woman who dressed fashionably risked immediate accusations of vanity. One who simply attracted attention risked widespread gossip. Beauty thus demanded constant and exhaustive self-policing. A woman had to appear attractive enough to satisfy social expectations, yet remain modest enough to avoid provoking either envy or unwelcome male desire. The margin for error in this balancing act was perilously narrow. The use of cosmetics intensely heightened this suspicion. Painted faces were commonly linked to lies, corrupting foreign influence, and even the dark arts of witchcraft. A woman who artificially altered her appearance was accused of hiding her true nature, implying that physical enhancement was merely a facade concealing moral decay beneath. The underlying fear was not just that women might deceive men, but that they might actually derive pleasure from doing so. In this restrictive environment, beauty often functioned as much as a liability as it did an asset. Women quickly learned to deflect attention, minimize praise, and publicly downplay their looks. Compliments were habitually met with denial. Admiration was treated as a calculated risk rather than a simple reward. Tudor society admired beauty in the abstract, but deeply distrusted it in practice. For women, being beautiful meant living under a perpetual cloud of suspicion. Praised only when politically useful, condemned when convenient, and always just one malicious rumor away from utter disgrace. Tudor beauty ideals were emphatically neither created by women nor maintained for their benefit. They operated within a rigid system that directly tethered female appearance to male authority. A woman's body and face were treated as visible reflections of the men who governed her father, her husband, or her king. Thus, beauty was not a form of self-expression. It was a public declaration of masculine control. A well-presented woman suggested a perfectly well-ordered household. Ratios varied. Stronger mixes were used at banquets as the evening progressed, but pure wine remained utterly unacceptable. Moderation was not merely social etiquette, it was proof of self-mastery. This belief shaped Roman identity. Romans admired discipline and control. Wine tested both. A man who lost control while drinking revealed a serious weakness of character. Public drunkenness invited ridicule and damaged reputation. Excess was tolerated privately but condemned publicly. The ideal Roman drank deeply without surrendering authority over his speech or behavior. Symposia and banquets followed structured drinking patterns. Toasts were offered to gods, ancestors, or political figures. Conversation guided the pace. Games determined who drank next. These rituals imposed order. Wine loosened tongues, but the structure of the convivium ensured that ritual restrained chaos. Social control was paramount, especially regarding women, who faced markedly stricter expectations. Respectable Roman women were generally expected to abstain entirely or drink only sparingly. Anxiety surrounding female independence was reflected in the persistent stories of women being punished for consuming wine. Thus, while wine symbolized a certain freedom, that freedom was always carefully monitored. Yet, glaring contradictions persisted across the social strata. Roman literature abounds with tales of inebriated emperors, senators, and military commanders. Satirists delighted in mercilessly exposing this hypocrisy. The continuous, widespread complaints from moralists suggest that the problem of overindulgence was pervasive. Ultimately, the rules governing moderate drinking existed precisely because they were so frequently flouted. Dilution was not only a cultural norm but also offered distinct practical benefits. Roman wine was strong, often unstable, and possessed a harsh flavor profile. Her composed demeanor and appropriately modest dress implied that the man in charge was successfully managing his domestic sphere. If a woman appeared too bold, too lavishly dressed, or excessively visible, it instantly reflected poorly on the men responsible for her. Her appearance became silent evidence in an unspoken evaluation of masculine competence. This explains why men regulated female beauty so meticulously. Sumptuary laws strictly dictated what women could wear based on social class, ensuring that appearance rigidly reinforced the existing hierarchy. Hairstyles, specific fabrics, jewelry, and even sleeve widths were subject to intense scrutiny. These regulations were primarily about containment, not aesthetic taste. Women were expressly forbidden from confusing social boundaries through their clothing or display. At court, this mechanism of control intensified significantly. Courtiers understood that a woman's visibility could swiftly translate into tangible influence. Attention created access, and access, in turn, created power. For men competing fiercely for royal favor, controlling how women appeared and how they were subsequently perceived became a paramount political strategy. Praise could successfully elevate. A targeted rumor could instantly destroy. Male anxiety also engineered the ideal of female silence. A woman who spoke excessively disrupted the carefully maintained visual order. Words introduced unwelcome unpredictability. Beauty, by sharp contrast, could be admired, judged, and ultimately contained. A quiet woman was easier to read, easier to manage, and simpler to place within the established hierarchies. Yet, this entire system was inherently unstable. Men relied heavily on women's beauty to advance familial interests while simultaneously fearing its potential influence. They encouraged attractiveness but ruthlessly punished autonomy. Mixing it with water softened the taste, reduced spoilage, and, critically, made it safe enough for daily consumption. In this sense, control perfectly aligned with convenience. Roman drinking culture ultimately reveals a society obsessed with achieving a precarious balance. Wine was recognized as essential, deeply pleasurable, and highly respected, yet it was also profoundly feared. Wine blurred the boundaries between rational thought and dangerous excess. By diluting the potent liquid, Romans enacted a symbolic dilution of danger itself. To drink like a Roman meant walking a disciplined line, enjoying abundance without ever fully surrendering control. The cup was never merely a vessel. It served as a liquid test of character, cultural integration, and personal discipline. In Roman society, wine transcended mere taste. It was a performance carefully staged to communicate status, generosity, and cultural literacy. What vintage was served, the manner of service, and the guest list were all meticulously managed components of this elaborate ritual. A formal Roman dinner was a profound public statement, even when held behind the closed doors of a private villa. Elite hosts used their cellars to display refinement and wealth. Serving rare, aged vintages signaled not only deep pockets but also patience. Offering obscure regional wines demonstrated vital access to extensive trade networks and political influence. Even the order in which wines were presented held significance. Cheaper or sweeter varieties often marked the start of the meal, with stronger or more prestigious options following as the evening progressed. This was not missed by attendees. Guests observed everything. They always noticed these subtle cues. The tableware reinforced these signals of wealth and taste. Fine, ornate cups, lavishly decorated mixing bowls, and elegant serving ladles elevated the dining experience. A woman who understood the power of her appearance and used it with intentional strategy risked immediate accusations of manipulation. Ignorance was demonstrably safer than awareness. Even Elizabeth I was subject to this underlying logic. She painstakingly shaped her image to assert authority without directly threatening masculine norms. Her beauty was symbolic, controlled, and framed as service to the state rather than personal ambition. She mastered the system by creating the appearance of submission to it. In Tudor England, female beauty was never simply about women themselves. It was a complex language men utilized to measure their control, maintain social hierarchy, and negotiate power among themselves. Women bore the direct consequences, but the system served male dominance as much as it did male insecurity. Despite the stringent restrictions placed upon them, Tudor women were not passive subjects of beauty culture. Within narrow limits, they learned to adapt, negotiate, and occasionally resist. Open defiance was rare and highly dangerous, but the subtle manipulation of appearance offered one of the few available forms of personal agency. Clothing became a tool of careful signaling. While sumptuary laws defined what women should wear, enforcement was often uneven. Women pushed boundaries through the quality of fabric, the complexity of embroidery, and accessories that technically complied with the law while still attracting elite attention. A sleeve cut slightly wider, a richer shade of dye, or a carefully chosen jewel could communicate status and ambition without overt violation. The message was perfectly visible to those who knew how to read it. Cosmetics, too, functioned as quiet resistance. Though morally condemned, they allowed women to exercise control over how they were perceived in a society that privileged appearance over truth. Whitening the face, softening severe features, or disguising the signs of age delayed severe social consequences. Furthermore, specific slaves, highly trained for wine service, managed the precise processes of dilution, temperature, and timing. Smooth, professional service reflected highly upon the host, while any mistakes suggested disorder and incompetence. Conversation flowed easily alongside the wine. Poetry was recited, politics were debated, and alliances were tested. Wine loosened tongues just enough to reveal character without allowing the abandonment of restraint. A guest who drank too eagerly risked social embarrassment. One who refused entirely appeared arrogant or aloof. Understanding this delicate social rhythm was absolutely essential. Lower classes participated in a dramatically different drinking culture. Tavern wine was substantially cheaper, harsher, and often heavily flavored to disguise flaws. Drinking in these establishments was louder, far less restrained, and fiercely communal. Respectability mattered less than temporary escape. Yet, even in the taverns, reputation still followed behavior. Wine inevitably exposed the drinker's true nature. Wine also explicitly marked major moments of transition. Weddings, funerals, military victories, and religious festivals all mandated drinking, but each context carried vastly different expectations. A funeral demanded quiet restraint. A triumph called for loud, communal excess. Knowing the precise difference was a fundamental part of Roman education. For freedmen and ambitious social climbers, hosting sophisticated dinners offered a precarious opportunity to imitate elite customs. Mistakes, however, were mercilessly mocked. Satirists delighted in exposing pretension through wine faux pas. Status could be displayed through performance, but it was never easily acquired. In Rome, wine certainly did not erase the existing social hierarchy. Rather, it emphasized it. Every single cup carried meaning far beyond mere flavor. To drink was to participate in a tightly coded language of power, manners, and identity. This effort was rooted in survival, not merely vanity. A woman who looked acceptable was significantly safer than one who looked honest. Speech and demeanor offered similar strategic options. Women learned precisely when to remain silent and when to speak indirectly. Compliments were reflexively deflected. Praise was reframed as obligation. Confidence was painstakingly masked as humility. These deliberate performances allowed women to participate in social life without triggering fatal accusations of arrogance or overweening ambition. It was a form of constant negotiation rather than total submission. Some women intentionally exploited beauty expectations. Ladies at court intimately understood how attention functioned. A carefully timed appearance, a controlled display of elegance, or a strategic absence could subtly influence outcomes without requiring formal authority. Such influence rarely left records, but its effects were profoundly felt. Beauty could open doors that rank alone could not. Even Elizabeth I's iconic image can be read as a form of resistance as much as conformity. She refused marriage, obsessively controlled her representation, and used beauty symbolically rather than personally. Her face became a powerful icon, not a vulnerability. By transforming herself into an image, she avoided becoming a possession. Resistance in Tudor England was rarely loud. It was encoded in fabric, gesture, timing, and silence. Women did not outright reject beauty standards, but they learned to maneuver within them, bending expectations without outright breaking the rules. The system remained in place, yet it was never as simple or as total as it pretended to be. Beauty constrained Tudor women, but it also equipped them with tools. Used carefully, appearance could protect, influence, and occasionally subvert the very rules meant to confine them. By the end of the Tudor period, one truth remained abundantly clear. Beauty was never neutral. Wine flowed everywhere in Roman life, but it never flowed freely. Each carefully measured sip reinforced who belonged, who merely aspired, and who ultimately fell short. Beyond its function as pleasure and status marker, Romans believed wine played a direct, critical role in maintaining good health. Medical writers treated wine not simply as a beverage but as a powerful pharmaceutical substance that could either heal or harm, depending entirely on the method of consumption. It was a form of treatment strictly regulated by the patient's age, the prevailing season, the individual's temperament, and their current physical condition. Roman medical theory was fundamentally rooted in the concept of balance. Health depended upon maintaining harmony among bodily qualities like heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Wine, being considered inherently warming and drying, could restore this internal equilibrium when administered correctly. Diluted wine was widely prescribed to aid digestion, stimulate appetite, and improve circulation. For the elderly, it was thought to restore declining vitality. For the sick, it could either strengthen or weaken the body, depending heavily on the prescribed dosage. Doctors routinely tailored specific wines for specific ailments. Lighter vintages were recommended for fevers, while stronger, aged wines were applied externally to wounds or taken internally for fatigue and persistent digestive issues. Wine mixed with herbs treated nearly everything, from chronic stomach pain to insomnia. Even mental health was addressed through controlled drinking, which was believed to ease anxiety and melancholy. Furthermore, water alone was considered potentially unsafe in many Roman settlements due to common contamination. Mixing water with wine effectively purified the beverage, making it far safer for daily consumption, especially in dense urban environments. Drinking diluted wine was thus a necessary practical step, as well as a cultural one. It offered women access, visibility, and influence, but it simultaneously placed them under perpetual, intense judgment. What appeared to be power was often conditional, temporary, and easily revoked. Beauty elevated women only so long as it effectively served prevailing political, familial, or moral expectations. For some, appearance opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. Beauty could secure a favorable marriage, attract royal attention, or grant social mobility. To court, it provided critical proximity to power. Yet, this access came at a cost. The same qualities that brought admiration also made women instantly vulnerable to gossip, suspicion, and punishment. Beauty did not protect women from control. It fundamentally intensified it. The danger lay in how quickly praise could reverse into blame. A woman celebrated for her elegance one year could be condemned for vanity the next. Shifts in fortune, politics, or male favor drastically reshaped how her appearance was interpreted. Beauty was praised when useful and condemned when inconvenient. Women had very little control over this abrupt ideological shift. Unlike wealth or title, beauty was inherently unstable. It faded inevitably with age, illness, or childbirth. Tudor society offered no reliable, alternative source of social value for women. Once appearance declined, authority, wisdom, and experience were rarely permitted to replace youth and physical appeal. For many women, beauty was their most visible asset and their most fragile one. Queens demonstrated this profound contradiction most clearly. Their beauty symbolized legitimacy, fertility, and divine approval, yet bound them to impossible standards. Elizabeth I's reign proved that mastery of image could sustain power, but only through relentless control and immense personal sacrifice. Her success was exceptional precisely because the system was engineered against women. For ordinary women, the stakes were quieter, but no less real. Nevertheless, Roman physicians constantly warned against the dangers of excess. Overindulgence overheated the body, severely weakened rational thought, and was believed to damage internal organs. Chronic drunkenness was frequently linked to madness and severe moral decay. Wine was acknowledged as powerful medicine, and like all medicine, it was inherently dangerous in the wrong hands. Age and gender heavily shaped specific recommendations. Young men were urged to drink sparingly to avoid reckless behavior, while older men were encouraged to drink more freely to maintain strength. Women were generally advised greater caution, reinforcing existing social controls. Children received wine only in heavily diluted forms, rendering it more a symbol than substance. Seasonal guidance also dictated consumption. More wine was advised in winter when the body demanded warmth, and less in the heat of summer, which required restraint. Even the time of day influenced advice. Drinking early in the day was frowned upon, though drinking late was generally tolerated. These meticulous beliefs reveal a Roman view of the body as something that demanded careful, rational management. Wine was neither good nor bad, it was merely potent. To drink well was synonymous with knowing oneself and exercising mastery. Health, in Roman thought, was achieved not through total avoidance, but through disciplined control. Wine perfectly fit this worldview. Dangerous if abused, tremendously beneficial if meticulously controlled. It embodied the Roman ideal of disciplined enjoyment, where pleasure served the body rather than dominating the will. When Roman political power finally collapsed in the West, wine itself did not vanish. Vineyards proved far more resilient than emperors, and Roman viticultural knowledge showed remarkable durability. Roads deteriorated and cities shrank, yet the vines continued to flourish on hillsides planted centuries earlier. Appearance shaped reputation, marriage prospects, and daily treatment. Beauty offered leverage, but it demanded constant, exhausting performance. Failure, whether through aging, illness, or rumor, carried consequences that could not easily be reversed. In the Tudor world, beauty functioned as both currency and cage. It allowed women limited movement within rigid structures, but never true freedom. The power it offered was real, yet profoundly precarious. And for most women, the cost of maintaining that power was lifelong vigilance in a society that never stopped watching. Wine endured primarily because it had become deeply embedded in daily diet, agricultural practice, and religious belief. Christianity repurposed wine's significance rather than rejecting it. Wine transitioned from the banquet hall to the altar, transformed into a sacred symbol through the Eucharist. In the Eastern Empire, Roman traditions continued almost uninterrupted. Roman techniques of cultivation, storage, and especially dilution were carried forward into monastic communities, where monks meticulously preserved and refined winemaking practices. Vineyards became vital centers of stability in an increasingly fractured world. In the West, regional styles gradually evolved, but their foundations remained distinctly Roman. Grape varieties, vineyard layouts, and fermentation methods all trace their lineage back to imperial experimentation and agricultural expansion. The concept that wine must be moderated also survived. Medieval writers echoed the ancient Roman warnings against excess. Drinking wine, diluted or spiced, remained a common practice. The moral language surrounding wine, emphasizing pleasure tempered by profound restraint, was inherited directly from Roman culture. Even modern wine culture still bears unmistakable Roman fingerprints. The subsequent spread of established vineyards across Europe follows Roman routes. The concept of terroir, the belief in matching soil and climate precisely to the grape varietal, clearly echoes Roman agricultural observation. Techniques like aging wine, labeling by vintage, and treating wine as both a daily staple and a luxury item all have explicit Roman precedents. Even the act of watering wine, once universal, lingers symbolically in certain customs and rituals today. Although modern drinkers overwhelmingly prefer purity, the Roman belief that wine is a powerful substance to be carefully managed, rather than consumed blindly, remains profoundly influential. Roman wine was admittedly unrefined by modern standards. It was often rough, heavily flavored, and unpredictable. Yet, its sociological and economic importance was unmatched. Wine fundamentally shaped landscapes, economies, and social life across an entire empire. In the end, Roman winemaking was fundamentally about exercising control over nature, control over the body, and control over culture. The vine evolved into a key tool of civilization. Long after Rome's political downfall, its vineyards continued to produce, quietly preserving an immense imperial legacy, one measured cup at a time.